Have you ever wondered what historical events led to the commencement of the Cold War? Let's take a step back in time. The end of the Second World War in 1945 marked a crucial turning point. With the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, two superpowers emerged onto the global stage, the United States and the Soviet Union. Ideological differences between these two nations were stark. The United States, championing capitalism and liberal democracy, stood in direct contrast to the Soviet Union's commitment to communism. Europe, still reeling from the devastation of war, found itself divided into two blocs: the democratic West, under the influence of the United States, and the communist East, under the influence of the Soviet Union. This division sowed the seeds of distrust, fear, and mutual suspicion between the East and the West. Thus, the stage was set for a major ideological conflict, the Cold War. So, who were the main players in this high-stakes game of political chess? At the heart of this conflict were two towering giants, each representing a different world order. On one side, the United States, the beacon of capitalism and democracy, and on the other, the Soviet Union, the champion of communism and central planning. These two superpowers, their ideologies at odds, led opposing blocs that divided the globe. These two superpowers would go on to shape the world for the next 4 decades. So, what strategies did these superpowers adopt to contain each other and expand their influence? Well, let's take a peek at the chessboard of global politics during the Cold War. On the American side, President Harry Truman introduced the Truman Doctrine in 1947. This policy aimed to contain the spread of communism by providing political, military, and economic assistance to nations under threat. The Marshall Plan, another American strategy, was designed to rebuild war-torn Europe economically to prevent the rise of communist parties. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union orchestrated the Warsaw Pact, a collective defense treaty among 8 communist states in Central and Eastern Europe. This pact was a direct counter to NATO, providing the Soviets with a buffer zone against potential invasions. These strategies of containment and expansion, driven by ideological differences and mutual suspicion, would set the pattern for much of the Cold War. But what was the role of the arms race in this global standoff? The arms race, a crucial facet of the Cold War, was a continuous escalation of weapon production between the superpowers, primarily focusing on nuclear weapons. As both the United States and the Soviet Union amassed vast arsenals, a terrifying concept emerged: mutually assured destruction, or MAD. This was the idea that if either side launched their nukes, the other would retaliate, leading to the total annihilation of both nations. It was a high-stakes stalemate, a deadly game of chicken on a global scale. This constant threat of annihilation led to a tense equilibrium. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage without risking total destruction, thereby maintaining a precarious balance of power. In essence, the arms race was a deterrent, a way to keep the peace through the threat of total devastation. The arms race, therefore, was a significant factor in maintaining a precarious balance of power. So, how did the Cold War influence international relations? Well, let's take a step back and look at some of the most significant events of this period. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, was a 13-day standoff that brought the world on the brink of nuclear war. The crisis was a result of the superpowers' chess-like maneuvers on the global stage, and it was a clear demonstration of the perilous nature of Cold War politics. The event had profound implications for international relations, leading to a new era of diplomacy, where direct communication lines, known as the Hotline, were established between Washington and Moscow. It also led to the signing of the Limited Test Ban Treaty, marking a small yet significant step towards nuclear disarmament. The geopolitical chessboard was constantly shifting, with nations aligning and realigning themselves based on their interests and ideologies. These events not only defined the Cold War era but also significantly influenced the course of international relations. But what were the effects of this conflict on countries caught in the crossfire? Consider Vietnam and Korea, two nations deeply scarred by the indirect clashes of the Cold War. The Vietnam War, a proxy war, resulted in catastrophic loss of life and devastation. It left Vietnam divided and its people grappling with the aftermath for decades. Similarly, the Korean War, another proxy conflict, bifurcated the Korean peninsula into North and South. It ignited an ongoing tension that persists to this day. In both scenarios, these nations became battlegrounds for competing ideologies, and the people the victims of a war they did not start. The Cold War also spurred economic, political, and social changes in these countries, often leading to authoritarian regimes and human rights abuses. In essence, the Cold War shaped the world map, redrawing borders and creating new political realities. The Cold War, therefore, had profound effects on not just the superpowers, but also on other countries around the world. So how did this prolonged period of political and military tension come to an end? Let's unravel this story thread by thread. The Berlin Wall, the physical and symbolic barrier between East and West, began to crumble in November of 1989. This momentous event was spurred by a wave of change sweeping through Eastern Europe, which was pushing towards greater freedoms. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was grappling with its own internal issues. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev, a new kind of Soviet leader who introduced policies of glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost, meaning openness, encouraged freedom of speech and transparency in government. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, aimed to overhaul the Soviet economy. These policies were a dramatic shift from previous Soviet regimes and marked a new era. However, the changes Gorbachev initiated were more than the Soviet Union could handle. The economy weakened, nationalist movements gained momentum, and the grip of the Communist Party began to loosen. By December of 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, replaced by the Russian Federation and 15 independent countries. This dissolution signaled the end of the Cold War, a conflict that had held the world in suspense for over 4 decades. It was a turning point in history, reshaping the global landscape and ushering in a new era of international relations. And so this marked the end of the Cold War, a conflict that had shaped much of the 20th century.